The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Hyderabad House in New Delhi, as President Roch Marc Christian Kabore of Burkina Faso stepped out of his black Mercedes. The year was 2019, and what happened in the next few hours would create ripples that would eventually reach the White House and shake diplomatic circles around the world. Inside the grand building, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi waited with his team of advisors. The official schedule showed this as a routine diplomatic visit, but the real agenda was far from ordinary. Behind closed doors, away from the media and curious eyes of international observers, two nations were about to forge an alliance that would change the economic landscape of West Africa forever. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in West Africa, had been struggling with economic challenges for years. Rich in gold and other natural resources, the country had never been able to fully capitalize on its mineral wealth. Traditional partnerships with former colonial powers had left them dependent and underdeveloped. President Kabore knew his country needed a new approach, a fresh partnership that could bring real change to his people. India, on the other hand, was emerging as a global economic powerhouse, with an insatiable appetite for natural resources to fuel its growing economy. Modi's government had been quietly expanding India's influence in Africa through strategic investments and partnerships. Unlike Western powers that often came with political strings attached, India offered something different: economic cooperation without interference in domestic affairs. The secret negotiations had been going on for months through diplomatic channels. Indian intelligence agencies had conducted detailed surveys of Burkina Faso's mineral deposits, while Burkinabe officials had studied India's industrial capabilities and market demands. Both sides realized they had found the perfect partner. During the meeting, President Kabore presented detailed maps showing unexplored gold mines and uranium deposits that could power India's nuclear program for decades. Modi's team responded with proposals for massive infrastructure projects, railways, ports, and processing facilities that would transform Burkina Faso's economy. The numbers being discussed were staggering, far beyond anything Burkina Faso had ever experienced. The atmosphere in the room was electric with possibility. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman outlined India's commitment to invest not just in resource extraction, but in building local capacity and creating jobs for Burkinabe citizens. This wasn't going to be the typical colonial-style resource grab that Africa had experienced for centuries. India was proposing a genuine partnership based on mutual benefit and long-term cooperation. As the hours passed, the details of an extraordinary deal began to take shape. India would commit $1.2 billion over 5 years to develop Burkina Faso's mining sector, build critical infrastructure, and establish joint ventures in manufacturing and technology. In return, India would receive preferential access to Burkina Faso's vast mineral resources and establish a strategic foothold in West Africa. What made this deal particularly sensitive was its timing and scope. The Trump administration had been pressuring African nations to limit their cooperation with countries like China and Russia. America's own interests in African resources were significant, and any major new player entering the game would inevitably attract Washington's attention. Both leaders knew they were walking into potentially troubled waters. The deal would need to be structured carefully to avoid triggering international sanctions or diplomatic retaliation. Secret clauses were built into the agreement, creating multiple layers of protection for both nations while ensuring the partnership could develop without external interference. The final handshake that evening sealed more than just a business deal. It marked the beginning of a new era in South-South cooperation, where developing nations could forge their own partnerships without seeking permission from traditional power centers. Neither Modi nor Kabore could have predicted just how dramatically this agreement would reshape international relations in the coming years. As President Kabore's plane lifted off from Delhi's Indira Gandhi International Airport the next morning, both leaders believed they had successfully kept their negotiations under wraps. They had no idea that intelligence agencies from multiple countries had already begun piecing together fragments of information about their secret talks. The stage was set for a diplomatic storm that would soon engulf capitals from Washington to Paris, fundamentally altering the balance of power in global resource politics. 3 months after the Delhi meeting, Sarah Chen sat in her cramped office at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, staring at satellite images that would change everything. As a senior analyst specializing in African affairs, she had seen many suspicious activities across the continent, but the construction projects appearing in Burkina Faso were unlike anything in her 15-year career. The images showed massive earth-moving equipment arriving at remote locations across Burkina Faso's gold-rich regions. Heavy machinery from Indian companies like Larsen and Toubro was being transported along newly constructed roads that didn't exist on any official maps. Most intriguingly, the construction pattern suggested a level of coordination and planning that required significant advanced knowledge of geological surveys. Sarah's team had been monitoring unusual financial flows from Indian banks to Burkina Faso for weeks. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars moving through complex networks of shell companies and offshore accounts. Traditional aid money moved through established channels with clear documentation, but this was different. These transactions had all the hallmarks of a major covert operation. The breakthrough came when NSA interceptors picked up encrypted communications between New Delhi and Ouagadougou discussing Project Golden Bridge. The code name alone was enough to trigger high-level alerts throughout the intelligence community. Further analysis revealed references to uranium shipments, strategic mineral reserves, and timeline discussions that painted a picture of something far more significant than routine trade agreements. Director of Central Intelligence William Burns was briefed on the AE findings during his morning intelligence update. The implications were immediately clear to everyone in the room. If India was securing exclusive access to Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, it could fundamentally alter global supply chains for critical resources. More concerning was the possibility that this represented a broader strategy by India to challenge Western dominance in African markets. The intelligence picture became even more alarming when cross-referencing revealed similar patterns of Indian investment and activity in other African nations. Mali, Niger, and Ghana were all showing signs of increased Indian presence, suggesting this wasn't an isolated, bilateral deal but part of a comprehensive strategy to establish Indian influence across West Africa's resource-rich region. What worried analysts most was the sophistication of the operation. Unlike Chinese investments in Africa, which were often highly visible and politically controversial, the Indian approach was remarkably subtle. They were building genuine partnerships with local governments, creating jobs for local workers, and investing in infrastructure that would benefit African communities long-term. This made it much harder for the United States to oppose the deals on moral or political grounds. The timing couldn't have been worse for American interests. President Trump had been advocating for an America First approach that had reduced U.S. engagement with many African nations. While America was pulling back, India was stepping in with attractive alternatives that African leaders found increasingly appealing. The Burkina Faso deal represented exactly the kind of strategic loss that Trump's critics had warned about. Intelligence reports from the State Department confirmed that several other African nations were already in discussions with India about similar arrangements. The success of the Burkina Faso partnership was being closely watched by governments across the continent who were looking for alternatives to traditional Western partnerships that often came with difficult conditions and limited benefits. The CIA's Africa desk began working around the clock to understand the full scope of India's continental strategy. What they discovered was a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been years in the making. Indian diplomats, business leaders, and technical experts had been quietly building relationships across Africa, identifying opportunities and laying the groundwork for exactly these kinds of breakthrough partnerships. Most troubling for American policymakers was the realization that India's approach was working. Unlike previous attempts by countries like China to establish influence in Africa through debt-trap diplomacy, India was offering genuine value propositions that African leaders found difficult to refuse. The partnerships were structured to benefit both sides, creating sustainable relationships that would be very difficult to disrupt. As Sarah prepared her final report for senior leadership, she knew it would trigger alarm bells throughout the government. The document would land on desks at the Pentagon, State Department, Treasury, and ultimately in the Oval Office. The question wasn't whether the Trump administration would respond to this intelligence, it was how dramatically they would react to what many were already calling the most significant shift in African geopolitics since the end of the Cold War. The race was now on to understand the full implications of India's African strategy and develop countermeasures before other nations began following Burkina Faso's lead. But as Sarah would soon learn, the intelligence community had already missed the most important development of all. The deal was about to get much bigger than anyone had imagined. The morning briefing in the Oval Office on March 15, 2020, started like any other, but it would end with President Donald Trump making phone calls that would reshape international diplomacy. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien had requested an urgent meeting to discuss what he described as a critical threat to American strategic interests in Africa. Trump, never one to appreciate lengthy intelligence briefings, was already showing signs of impatience when O'Brien began explaining the situation. Mr. President, we've discovered that India has signed a secret deal with Burkina Faso worth over $1 billion, O'Brien began, spreading satellite photos and financial documents across the Resolute desk. This isn't just about money. They're gaining control of some of the world's largest untapped gold and uranium reserves. Trump's reaction was immediate and explosive. Are you telling me that India is making deals in Africa behind our backs, while we're giving them trade benefits and treating them like allies? His voice rose with each word, and staffers outside the Oval Office could hear the president's anger through the thick doors. The details that followed only intensified Trump's fury. The briefing revealed that Prime Minister Modi had personally orchestrated the deal during secret negotiations that deliberately excluded American oversight. Even worse, intelligence suggested that several other African nations were already in discussions with India about similar arrangements, potentially locking American companies out of billions of dollars in mineral rights and infrastructure contracts. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who had joined the meeting via secure video link from his travels in Eastern Europe, tried to provide context about India's growing global ambitions. Mr. President, this appears to be part of a broader strategy by India to challenge Chinese influence in Africa, while simultaneously reducing their dependence on Western partnerships. They're positioning themselves as the democratic alternative to Chinese investment. But Trump wasn't interested in geopolitical nuance. To him, this was a personal betrayal by Modi, whom he had welcomed to the White House with great ceremony and considered a friend. I gave Modi everything he wanted: trade deals, defense partnerships, support against China. And this is how he repays us. By stabbing us in the back in Africa? The president immediately demanded to know why American intelligence agencies had failed to prevent the deal from happening. CIA Deputy Director David Cohen, participating by secure phone, explained that the operation had been conducted with extraordinary secrecy, using diplomatic channels and financial networks that were difficult to monitor. Sir, the Indians learned from watching Chinese operations in Africa. They avoided all the usual mistakes that would have triggered our early warning systems. Trump's anger shifted toward his own administration. So you're telling me we have the best intelligence agencies in the world, and a country like Burkina Faso, which most Americans couldn't find on a map, managed to make $1 billion deal right under our noses? The president's frustration with what he saw as intelligence failures would later become a recurring theme in his complaints about the deep state. The conversation took a more serious turn when Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin briefed the president on the potential economic implications. American companies had been eyeing West African mineral resources for years, but bureaucratic delays and risk assessments had slowed their entry into these markets. Now India was moving aggressively to secure long-term access to the same resources, potentially pricing American competitors out of the market for decades. What angered Trump most was the realization that India's success in Burkina Faso could inspire other nations to seek alternatives to American partnerships. If every country starts thinking they can just ignore us and make deals with whoever they want, where does that leave America's position in the world? He demanded. The meeting's tone shifted dramatically when Trump decided on immediate action. Get Modi on the phone right now, he ordered. And I want to know everything about this deal: who authorized it, how much they're really spending, and what other countries they're talking to. The president was clearly preparing for what his staff knew would be a very difficult conversation with the Indian Prime Minister. Within hours, the State Department was instructed to prepare a formal diplomatic protest, while the Treasury Department began exploring potential sanctions against Indian companies involved in the Burkina Faso project. Trump also ordered an immediate review of all U.S.-India trade agreements, suggesting he was prepared to use economic leverage to force India to reconsider their African strategy. The president's reaction sent shockwaves through the foreign policy establishment. Career diplomats who had spent years building the U.S.-India strategic partnership watched in horror as decades of careful relationship building seemed to crumble in a single morning. Many warned that Trump's confrontational approach could push India further away from American influence, potentially driving them into closer cooperation with China or Russia. But Trump was unmoved by such concerns. In his view, America had been too generous with allies who didn't show proper appreciation for American support. The Burkina Faso deal represented everything he disliked about traditional foreign policy, other countries benefiting from American weakness while pursuing their own interests at America's expense. As news of the president's reaction began leaking to the press, diplomatic channels buzzed with speculation about how far Trump might go in his confrontation with India. The stage was set for a diplomatic crisis that would test not only U.S.-India relations, but America's ability to maintain its influence in an increasingly multipolar world, where traditional allies were pursuing independent strategies. At exactly 2:47 p.m. Washington time on March 16, 2020, the secure line in the Oval Office rang with an incoming call that would either repair or permanently damage the relationship between the world's oldest and largest democracies. President Trump had spent the previous evening preparing for what his staff described as the most important phone call of his presidency regarding India. Prime Minister Modi, awakened at 1:17 a.m. Delhi time, knew this conversation would determine the future of India's African strategy and possibly its broader relationship with the United States. Namaste, Donald, Modi began in his careful English, using the informal greeting that had characterized their previous friendly exchanges. But Trump's response was immediate and cold. "Cut the pleasantries, Modi. We need to talk about your secret billion-dollar deal in Africa. Did you really think we wouldn't find out?" The tension was palpable even through the secure satellite connection. Modi's team of advisors gathered in the Prime Minister's residence at 7 Racecourse Road had anticipated this moment, but hoped American intelligence would take longer to piece together the full picture. "Donald, I think there may be some misunderstanding about our partnership with Burkina Faso. This is simply economic cooperation between developing nations." Trump's voice rose immediately. "Don't give me that diplomatic garbage. You went behind our backs and made a deal that cuts American companies out of billions in mineral rights. After everything we've done for India, the trade deals, the defense partnership, standing with you against China, this is how you repay us." The conversation that followed would be dissected by diplomatic historians for years to come. Modi attempted to explain India's position using the language of strategic autonomy and South-South cooperation, emphasizing that the deal with Burkina Faso wasn't directed against American interests. "We are not choosing between partners, Donald. We are simply expanding our partnerships to include African nations who have been historically marginalized." But Trump wasn't interested in diplomatic nuance. "You're talking about margins while you're stealing deals worth billions from American companies. My people tell me you've got similar talks going on with half of West Africa. That sounds like choosing sides to me." The turning point came when Modi made a critical miscalculation. Attempting to assert India's independence, he said, "Donald, with respect, India cannot ask for American permission every time we want to do business with other nations. We are a sovereign country with our own interests to pursue." Trump's reaction was explosive. "Sovereign? You want to talk about sovereignty while you're taking our money and stabbing us in the back? Maybe India is too sovereign to need American trade benefits anymore. Maybe you're too sovereign for our defense technology. Maybe you can handle China all by yourself." The threat was unmistakable. Trump was suggesting he might terminate the various agreements that had made India one of America's most important strategic partners in Asia. Modi's advisors watched their prime minister's face change as he realized the conversation was spiraling beyond diplomatic recovery. "Donald, please. Let us discuss this calmly," Modi tried to interject, but Trump was already building momentum. "I trusted you, Modi. I welcomed you to America. I gave you everything you asked for, and you played me for a fool." "Nobody plays Donald Trump for a fool." The call took an even more dramatic turn when Trump began outlining specific consequences. I'm ordering a complete review of every trade deal we have with India. I'm putting holds on technology transfers, and if you think you can just ignore us and do whatever you want in Africa, you're about to learn how expensive that mistake can be. Modi found himself in an impossible position. Backing down would make India appear weak to other nations considering similar partnerships. But continuing to defend the deal risked permanent damage to India's most important bilateral relationship. His response would be remembered as one of the most significant moments in modern Indian diplomacy. "Donald, I understand your concerns, but I cannot and will not cancel a legitimate business arrangement because of threats," Modi said firmly. India has always been a reliable partner to America, but we cannot be a subordinate partner. If America chooses to punish India for pursuing our economic interests through legal means, then perhaps we need to reconsider what kind of partnership we really have. The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in diplomatic conversations. When Trump finally spoke, his voice was different, more calculated and dangerous. "Fine, Modi, you want to play hardball? Let's see how your economy handles some real pressure. You just made the biggest mistake of your political career." The call ended abruptly when Trump hung up without the customary diplomatic pleasantries. In New Delhi, Modi sat in stunned silence as his advisors tried to process what had just happened. They had prepared for American displeasure, but nobody had anticipated Trump would react so personally and aggressively to what India viewed as routine economic diplomacy. Within hours, both governments began implementing the consequences of that disastrous phone call. The State Department issued an unprecedented public statement, expressing serious concerns about India's failure to consult with partners before making significant commitments in regions of mutual strategic interest. Meanwhile, India's External Affairs Ministry released its own statement defending India's sovereign right to pursue mutually beneficial economic partnerships with any nation. The diplomatic earthquake had begun, and its aftershocks would be felt from Washington to New Delhi to Ouagadougou. What had started as a business deal between India and Burkina Faso had become a fundamental test of whether traditional alliance structures could survive. In an era where even friendly nations pursued independent strategies, the answer to that question would reshape global diplomacy for years to come. The morning after Trump's explosive phone call with Modi, financial markets around the world opened to chaos that nobody had anticipated. The Bombay Stock Exchange plummeted by 12% in the first hour of trading, as investors panicked over the potential collapse of U.S.-India relations. In New York, companies with significant Indian operations saw their share prices crater as traders bet on a full-scale economic war between the world's two largest democracies. The immediate trigger was Trump's early morning tweet storm that began at 5:23 a.m. India has chosen to betray American friendship with their secret billion-dollar deal in Africa. We will respond strongly to protect American workers and businesses. No more free rides for countries that stab us in the back. Within hours, the Trump administration began implementing what officials called targeted economic measures, but what quickly became the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a Democratic ally. The Treasury Department froze pending technology transfers worth $3.2 billion, while the Commerce Department placed restrictions on American companies bidding for Indian government contracts. The message was clear. There would be real costs for countries that pursued independent foreign policies without American approval. India's response was swift and dramatic. Prime Minister Modi convened an emergency session of his cabinet and announced what he called Operation Strategic Independence. Within 48 hours, India had signed preliminary agreements with Russia to purchase advanced defense systems that they had previously planned to buy from America. European companies suddenly found themselves flooded with inquiries from Indian businesses looking to replace American suppliers. The global implications became apparent when other nations began choosing sides. China, sensing an opportunity to drive a wedge between two important democratic allies, offered India preferential trade terms and expedited approvals for stalled infrastructure projects. President Xi Jinping personally called Modi to express support for India's right to pursue independent economic partnerships without external interference. European leaders found themselves in an impossible position. French President Emmanuel Macron attempted to mediate between Trump and Modi, but both leaders were too angry to consider compromise. German Chancellor Angela Merkel warned that the dispute could destabilize global supply chains and damage the world economy. But her concerns fell on deaf ears in both Washington and New Delhi. The situation in Burkina Faso became even more complicated as international pressure mounted from multiple directions. French officials, still considering West Africa their sphere of influence, demanded explanations from President Kabore about why he had negotiated with India without consulting Paris. France has been Burkina Faso's partner for decades, declared Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian. These kinds of major agreements should involve traditional allies, not create new dependencies. American pressure on Burkina Faso was more direct and threatening. The State Department warned that countries accepting Indian investment deals might find themselves excluded from American aid programs and trade benefits. Several African nations that had been considering similar partnerships with India suddenly became much more cautious about proceeding. But the most dramatic escalation came when Trump decided to make the dispute personal. During a campaign rally in Michigan, he launched into an extended attack on Modi that shocked diplomatic observers worldwide. "I thought Modi was my friend, but he's just another politician who smiles to your face while stealing from your pocket. India wants to play games? We'll show them what American economic power really looks like." The international business community watched in horror as two of the world's largest economies began decoupling key sectors of their relationship. American tech companies that had invested billions in Indian operations faced impossible choices between their Indian business and potential American government retaliation. Indian pharmaceutical companies that supplied critical medications to American patients suddenly found their approvals delayed indefinitely. The human cost became apparent within weeks. American farmers who had expanded soybean production specifically for the Indian market saw prices collapse as India turned to Brazilian suppliers. Indian software engineers working for American companies on temporary visas found their renewal applications mysteriously delayed. The economic warfare was creating real suffering for ordinary people who had nothing to do with the original dispute over African mineral rights. International observers began warning that the dispute was spinning completely out of control. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, made rare public comments expressing concern that economic nationalism and retaliation between democratic partners was undermining global stability. The International Monetary Fund downgraded global growth projections, specifically citing the U.S.-India dispute as a major risk factor. Most surprisingly, the economic warfare began attracting support from unexpected quarters in America. Progressive Democrats who normally opposed Trump's policies found themselves agreeing that India's African strategy represented unfair competition for American businesses. Senator Elizabeth Warren issued a statement saying, "While I disagree with President Trump's methods, America cannot allow other nations to lock us out of global markets through secretive deals that bypass fair competition." The irony wasn't lost on foreign policy experts who noted that Trump's reaction to India's independent diplomacy was pushing India closer to the very countries America most wanted to contain. China and Russia were delighted to welcome India as a partner in what they called a multipolar world order, free from American dominance. As the crisis entered its second month, neither side showed any sign of backing down. Modi's approval ratings in India actually increased as ordinary Indians rallied around their leader in the face of what they saw as American bullying. Trump's base supported his tough stance, viewing it as proof that he was finally holding allies accountable for taking advantage of America's generosity. The stage was set for an even more dramatic escalation that nobody could have predicted. The Burkina Faso deal that had started everything was about to become the least important aspect of a crisis that was reshaping the entire global order. 6 months after the crisis began, an unexpected phone call to the White House would end the most serious diplomatic dispute between Democratic allies since World War II. But the resolution would come from the most unlikely source imaginable: President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore of Burkina Faso himself, the man whose country's partnership with India had triggered the entire international crisis. By September 2020, the economic warfare between America and India had caused massive damage to both countries. American businesses had lost an estimated $47 billion in Indian contracts and investments, while India's economy had contracted by 2.3% due to the loss of American technology transfers and market access. Both Trump and Modi were facing increasing domestic pressure to find a solution. But neither could back down without appearing weak to their political bases. The breakthrough came when President Kabore made a decision that stunned diplomatic circles worldwide. Instead of simply watching two superpowers fight over his country's resources, he decided to take control of the situation himself. In a move that demonstrated remarkable political courage, he announced that Burkina Faso would invite American companies to participate in the Indian-funded development projects, creating a three-way partnership that nobody had considered possible. Burkina Faso is not a prize to be fought over by great powers, Kabore declared in a speech that would be remembered as a defining moment in African diplomacy. We are a sovereign nation capable of choosing multiple partners and creating win-win solutions that benefit everyone involved. The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity. American companies would be invited to participate in construction and logistics for the Indian-funded mining projects, while Indian companies would gain access to American technology and expertise that could improve their efficiency. Burkina Faso would benefit from the combined resources and competition between American and Indian partners, potentially doubling the value of their original agreement with India. Trump's initial reaction was skeptical, but his economic advisors quickly recognized the opportunity. American construction companies like Caterpillar and Bechtel could secure billions in contracts without the United States government having to invest any money up front. American technology companies could access Indian-developed markets while contributing their expertise to projects that were already fully funded. Modi faced a more difficult decision. Accepting American participation would mean sharing control of projects that India had originally intended to dominate exclusively. However, his advisors pointed out that Indian companies would benefit significantly from access to advanced American technology and expertise, potentially making the projects more profitable in the long run. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything in modern diplomatic history. Instead of traditional government-to-government talks, the discussions involved corporate executives, mining engineers, and financial experts from 3 continents working together to redesign deals worth billions of dollars. The complexity was staggering, but the potential benefits were enormous for everyone involved. The final agreement, signed in November 2020, created what experts called the Ouagadougou model, a new form of multilateral economic partnership that would be copied by developing nations worldwide. India maintained primary responsibility for mining operations and infrastructure development, while American companies handled logistics, technology integration, and international marketing. Burkina Faso retained sovereign control over its resources, while benefiting from the combined expertise of 2 economic superpowers. The signing ceremony in Burkina Faso's capital was attended by delegations from all 3 countries, but the real stars were the African leaders who had watched the entire crisis unfold. Presidents from across the continent came to witness what many called the birth of a new model for African development, one where African nations could play major powers against each other to secure better deals for their people. The human impact of the resolution was immediate and dramatic. American farmers regained access to Indian markets, while Indian pharmaceutical companies resumed normal operations in America. The thousands of workers who had lost their jobs due to the economic warfare found new opportunities in the expanded African projects. Stock markets that had been volatile for months finally stabilized as investors realized the crisis had created new opportunities rather than permanent damage. Most importantly, the resolution demonstrated that small nations could influence global diplomacy if they were willing to take risks and think creatively. President Kabore became an international celebrity, invited to speak at universities and conferences worldwide about how developing nations could navigate great power competition to their advantage. The long-term implications were even more significant. The success of the 3-way partnership encouraged other African nations to pursue similar arrangements, leading to a new era of competitive cooperation between major powers on the continent. China, Russia and European nations all began offering better terms to African partners, who demonstrated they had alternatives. For Trump and Modi, the resolution provided a face-saving way to end their damaging dispute, while actually achieving better outcomes than either had originally hoped for. Both leaders claimed victory, Trump for forcing India to include American companies in their African projects, Modi for maintaining India's African strategy, while gaining American expertise. The crisis that had begun with a secret handshake in New Delhi ended with a public celebration in Ouagadougou that redefined how the world thought about international partnerships. The $1.2 billion deal that had shocked Trump ultimately created a new model for global cooperation that benefited everyone involved. Most remarkably, it proved that in an interconnected world, even the smallest nations could play decisive roles in shaping the future of international relations. The Burkina Faso crisis, as historians would later call it, marked the end of the era when major powers could simply impose their will on smaller nations. Instead, it ushered in a new age of multilateral partnerships where everyone had something to gain from cooperation, and everyone had something to lose from confrontation.